If you're about to drop a few $1,000s on a new bike, there's something worth checking before you swipe your card that has nothing to do with the frame material or the group set. Whether the company that made it is actually going to be around next year to honor the warranty, ship you replacement parts, or even answer the phone. Because right now, in 2026, a genuinely alarming number of bike brands, some of them names you'd recognize instantly, are quietly buckling under debt, inventory they can't sell, and financing that's drying up. And most riders have absolutely no idea it's happening until their favorite brand's website suddenly stops taking orders. The most dramatic example is unfolding right now with Accel Group, a Netherlands-based conglomerate that most casual riders have never heard of, but that actually owns a shocking number of well-known names: Haibike, Lapierre, Ghost, Raleigh, Winora, Batavus, Sparta, Koga, and the cargo bike brands Babbo and Carcon. In early August 2026, Accel announced it could no longer meet its financial obligations and initiated formal insolvency proceedings in the Netherlands. This wasn't a sudden shock. The company had been bleeding for years, reporting a net loss of roughly 390 million euros back in 2023, alongside a steep revenue drop, and it went through not one, but two separate debt restructurings, trying to survive. The first cutting its debt from around 1.4 billion euros down to 800 million. The second handing control from its private equity owner, KKR, over to lenders in a last-ditch effort to avoid exactly this outcome. As recently as July 2026, a Singapore-based buyer called Dutech Group looked ready to purchase the company, and regulators in Germany, Austria, and Poland had already cleared the deal. Then it fell apart, and days later, Accel filed for insolvency anyway. If you own a Lapierre, a Haibike, or a Raleigh, this is exactly the kind of situation where warranty claims and parts availability can suddenly become a real problem, even though the brand itself might not vanish overnight. Accel's collapse is the biggest name on this list, but it is far from alone, and understanding why so many brands are hitting the wall at the same time actually helps explain what's happening to the industry as a whole. During the pandemic, bike sales exploded. People stuck at home, avoiding public transit, looking for outdoor activities, bought bikes at a pace the industry had never seen before. And brands responded the only way they knew how. They ordered enormous quantities of inventory, took on debt to fund rapid expansion, and, in more than 100 cases, took private equity money that came with growth targets built entirely around that pandemic-era demand curve, continuing indefinitely. It didn't continue. Once people went back to offices, back to their normal routines, demand didn't just slow down, it fell off a cliff relative to what brands had planned for, and companies were left holding warehouses full of bikes nobody wanted to buy at full price. That combination, oversupply plus debt plus demand that never came back, is the root cause behind almost every brand collapse you're about to hear about. Rad Power Bikes is a perfect case study in how fast this can unravel, and it's a name a lot of American riders know well, since it was one of the most visible e-bike brands in the country for years. In December 2025, Rad Power filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in federal court in Washington state, listing around $32 million in assets against nearly $73 million in liabilities. Its gross sales had collapsed from roughly $130 million in 2023 down to about $63 million through most of 2025, and a chunk of its debt, more than $8 million, was owed directly to U.S. Customs and Border Protection for unpaid import tariffs. Making matters worse, the Consumer Product Safety Commission had issued a public warning just weeks before the filing, urging owners of certain older Rad batteries to stop using them entirely due to fire risk, and the company told the agency it couldn't afford to fund a recall, given its financial state. Rad is currently trying to sell itself rather than shut down completely, which means the brand name could survive under new ownership, but if you're sitting on an older Rad bike with one of the flagged battery models, that safety warning matters regardless of what happens to the company financially. The direct-to-consumer model that a lot of these newer e-bike and mountain bike brands built their entire identity around has taken an especially hard hit, and German mountain bike brand YT Industries is a case that shows exactly why. YT built its reputation selling high-performance bikes straight to riders, cutting out traditional dealers to offer better prices. And during the pandemic boom, it looked like proof that the model worked. Then, in July 2025, YT's private equity backer pulled its funding entirely, and the company was forced into a self-administered insolvency process in Germany. What makes YT's story genuinely interesting, though, is what happened next. Founder Markus Flossmann, who'd already returned as CEO the year before to try to right the ship, moved to buy the company back himself rather than let it disappear. And the brand has been working through a relaunch since. It's one of the more hopeful outcomes on this list, but it also illustrates just how fragile even a well-known, well-loved brand's finances can be once a single investor decides to stop writing checks. Kona Bikes went through a nearly identical roller coaster, and if you've been riding mountain bikes for more than a few years, you probably remember the chaos around this one. Kona's founders sold the brand to a Canadian outdoor conglomerate called Kent Outdoors back in 2022, right at the peak of pandemic-era bike demand. 2 years later, in April 2024, Kent Outdoors abruptly announced it was shutting Kona down, laying off much of the staff and pulling the brand from that year's Sea Otter Classic, one of the biggest events on the cycling calendar, with almost no warning. Just a few weeks later, in a plot twist nobody in the industry expected, Kona's original founders, Dan Gerhard and Jake Heilbrunn, bought the company back and started rebuilding it around a more traditional dealer network, instead of the direct-to-consumer approach that had struggled under Kent's ownership. Kona survived, but only because its founders were willing and able to step back in, which isn't a safety net every struggling brand has waiting in the wings. Before you assume this is only a problem for e-bike startups or direct-to-consumer disruptors, it's worth knowing that plenty of long-established, traditionally distributed brands have been hit just as hard. Rocky Mountain Bicycles, a Canadian brand with decades of mountain biking heritage behind it, filed for creditor protection in January 2025 as part of the same broader wave of post-pandemic financial pressure. Around the same time, GT Bicycles, another storied name in the sport, announced it was pausing new product releases and streamlining operations amid its own layoffs. Titanium bike maker Linsky, a Tennessee-based company that had been building frames in the US for 2 decades, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in April 2026, citing reduced cash flow and rising material costs, and reportedly kept selling bikes on its website even after customers who'd already paid were left waiting months with no bike and no refund. Up in North Vancouver, Nolly Bikes had its bank account called by its lender and a receiver appointed in early 2026, forcing the small, well-regarded brand into its own restructuring scramble. None of these are fly-by-night operations. These are brands with genuine histories and loyal riders, and they've all been caught in the same financial vice. If any of this is making you nervous about a bike you're currently eyeing, here's a simple move. Before you buy from a smaller or newer brand, do a quick search for the company name, alongside words like insolvency or financial trouble, so you know what you're actually walking into, and drop a comment letting this channel know which brand you're curious about, because there's a good chance it's already come up in the reporting on this industry-wide shakeout. Tariffs have made an already difficult situation considerably worse, and this is a piece of the story that doesn't get enough attention outside of trade publications. A large share of the bike industry's supply chain runs through China and Taiwan, from complete bikes to individual components, and shifting US tariff policy in recent years has added dramatically to landed costs for brands that were already struggling with thin margins and bloated inventory. Some reporting on the YT industry situation put combined tariff rates on bikes coming from China and Taiwan as high as the 40 to 60% range at various points, layered on top of existing supply chain disruptions that never fully resolved after the pandemic. For a brand already carrying debt from an overbuilt inventory position, an unexpected jump in the cost of every future shipment can be the difference between limping toward recovery and being forced into bankruptcy court, which is part of why so many of these filings have clustered together in such a tight window rather than being spread evenly across the past several years. The Excel situation is worth sitting with a bit longer because the scale of it is genuinely hard to overstate for anyone who rides one of its brands. This is a company that in 2022 sold more than 845,000 bicycles and generated 1.4 billion euros in revenue, a business large enough that KKR paid roughly 1.8 billion euros to acquire it that same year, betting that the e-bike boom would keep climbing. Instead, demand cratered faster than anyone at the firm anticipated. Dealers ended up sitting on excessive inventory, and the whole market descended into an aggressive discounting war that crushed margins across every brand in the portfolio. At the height of the crisis in late 2023, Accel reportedly had around 340,000 finished bicycles sitting in warehouses with nowhere to go, forcing the kind of fire sale pricing that keeps a brand's revenue numbers looking almost normal on paper, while its actual profitability collapses underneath. Headcount tells the same story in a different way. Accel employed more than 3,500 people across its operations a few years ago, and that number had already shrunk to around 2,000 by the time insolvency proceedings began, spread across 15 countries. KKR's own losses on the deal have been estimated at over €1 billion, which gives you a sense of just how badly the numbers moved against everyone involved, not just the company itself. It's worth understanding what insolvency proceedings in the Netherlands actually mean in practice, because the word alone tends to conjure images of a company disappearing overnight, and that's not necessarily what's happening here. Dutch law includes a specific process, sometimes translated as a provisional suspension of payments, designed for companies facing serious liquidity problems, but that still have a business model considered fundamentally viable. A court-appointed administrator steps in to study the options, which can include bringing in new investors, selling off individual divisions or brands separately, or in some cases letting certain brands continue operating independently, even if the parent company doesn't survive intact. That means it's entirely possible that a brand like Ghost or Winora ends up under different ownership within a year, still making bikes, still honoring at least some warranty obligations, even though the Accel name itself might not exist in its current form. It's a messier, slower outcome than a clean bankruptcy, but it's also not automatically the end of the road for any individual brand caught up in it. The direct-to-consumer collapse pattern extends well beyond YT Industries, and it's become common enough that people inside the industry have started openly questioning whether skipping traditional bike shop dealers was ever the sound long-term strategy it was marketed as during the pandemic boom. The appeal was obvious at the time: cut out the dealer markup, sell straight to riders online, and pocket the difference or pass savings along to customers. What that model struggled with once demand slowed was exactly the kind of cash crunch that sank RadPower and nearly sank YT. Because a direct-to-consumer brand carries the full weight of unsold inventory itself, with no network of independent dealers absorbing some of that risk the way a traditional wholesale relationship would. RadPower's own numbers illustrate this starkly. Gross sales fell from about $130 million in 2023 to roughly $104 million in 2024, then to just $63 million through most of 2025, a decline steep enough that no amount of cost-cutting was going to close the gap in time. When a bike shows up in your driveway shipped directly from a warehouse, rather than assembled and sold by a local dealer, that convenience came with a financial structure that turned out to be far more fragile than most riders realized while they were enjoying the lower prices. Not every story here ends badly, and it's worth being clear about that because doom and gloom isn't the full picture. Van Moof, the Dutch e-bike brand once nicknamed the Tesla of e-bikes, went bankrupt back in 2023 after burning through more than $100 million in funding, but it found new ownership and continued operating, honoring service and parts commitments for existing riders in the process. Cake, the Swedish electric motorcycle maker, went through a similar bankruptcy then rescue cycle. Revel, another mountain bike brand that hit trouble in 2025, was bought back by its own founders in a pattern that's becoming almost familiar at this point. Private equity or corporate ownership overextends during boom times. The company hits a wall, and the people who actually built the brand step back in to save what they can. These outcomes matter for consumers because a brand that gets rescued, even through bankruptcy court, usually keeps honoring warranties and stocking parts in some form, which is a very different experience from a brand that simply disappears. There's also a component and accessories angle to this story that writers rarely think about until it directly affects them. When a brand like Accel or Rad Power goes through insolvency or bankruptcy, it's not just the complete bikes on the sales floor that get affected. Proprietary battery packs, brand-specific frame parts, and custom electronics, all things that can't simply be swapped for a generic replacement from another manufacturer, become much harder to source once a company's supply chain and support staff get disrupted by a restructuring process. This is a bigger problem for e-bikes than for traditional bikes, since a dead battery on a bike from a defunct brand can turn an otherwise perfectly good machine into an expensive paperweight if no replacement pack is ever produced again. Riders who bought heavily into a single e-bike ecosystem, batteries, chargers, and diagnostic tools all locked to one proprietary system, are carrying a form of risk that traditional bike owners mostly don't have to think about, since a derailleur or a brake caliper can usually be replaced with something from a different brand entirely if needed. So what does all of this actually mean if you're just trying to buy a decent bike without accidentally betting your warranty on a company that might not exist in 6 months? It doesn't mean avoiding every smaller or newer brand entirely, because plenty of financially healthy companies exist alongside the ones in trouble. And some of the brands that went through restructuring, like Kona and YT, have come out the other side more stable than before. What it does mean is treating brand financial health as a real factor in a purchase decision, the same way you'd think about a car manufacturer's reliability record or a mattress company's return policy. Check whether a brand has been in the news for layoffs, restructuring, or missed shipments recently. Be cautious about prepaying large deposits for pre-order bikes from smaller direct-to-consumer companies, since that's exactly the kind of unsecured claim that gets stuck behind banks and suppliers in a bankruptcy filing, as more than one Linsky customer found out the hard way. And if you're buying from one of the bigger, publicly troubled names, like the Accel-owned brands right now, it's worth asking your local dealer directly about parts availability and warranty support before you commit, because dealers on the ground often know which brands are still functioning normally behind the scenes and which ones are running on fumes. The bike industry's post-pandemic hangover isn't over yet, and if the pattern of the last 3 years holds, it's unlikely that Accel will be the last major name to hit the wall before this shakeout finally runs its course. If this kind of behind-the-scenes industry reporting is useful to you, subscribe so you don't miss the next brand that ends up on this list, because unfortunately, based on everything happening right now, there's probably going to be one.